Hello, Brubs. We're back with Buried Alive, the terrifying history of our most primal fear by Jan Bondeson. We are on chapter 9, the final struggle. I dare not breathe the sequel loud. I twould. The hell? How did the hell did you get here so fast? What's up, buddy? I fucking didn't even get one sentence on this guy's like, what's up, Bubba? Buddy, you know what I got? I got some books. Books! The final struggle. I dare not breathe the sequel loud. Twould. What's he got? He's laughing. Twould horrify lone folk of how they drape me in my shroud, mid course and brutal joke, and how upon my coffin lid I heard the hammer's stroke. Better than something else getting stroked, buddy. The verses quoted above and later in the chapter are from Living with the Dead, a truly dreadful 32 stanza poem by a certain Mark Melford, published in the magazine of the organized anti premature burial activists in England. The organization was not the first of its kind. It is recorded that a society was formed in Weimar just before the first waiting mortuary was built, with the express purpose of safeguarding its members from premature internment. Similar bodies existed in Germany throughout the 19th century. They employed doctors to watch the bodies of deceased individuals in the morgue until the onset of putrefaction, or sometimes also to open an artery after death had been confirmed. One was founded by Colonel von Falkenhausen in Breslau in 1860, and another was later active in Berlin, campaigning for cremation as the only safeguard against premature burial. In France, a body of concerned parties formed after Cardinal Donat's appeal in 1866, and in America, the agitation of Alexander Wilder had a similar result. None of these organizations made much of an impact, however, and little is known about their activities. The London Society for the Prevention of Premature Burial was formed in 1896 by Mr. Arthur Lovell, who was a somewhat shady character, a spiritualist, quack, and author of books on self healing and other forms of medical humbug. Is it Lovell or Lavelle? Lovell and the co founders of the society set out its three aims: the scientific study of apparent death and catalepsy, popular agitation to make people aware of the risk of being prematurely buried, and the service to members that doctors employed by the society would make sure that they were never buried alive. That's brilliant. The society's leading light was a somewhat more respectable figure, the traveler and controversialist. That's a thing. Just go around being controversial. William Tebb. Under his leadership, it expanded over the Atlantic and also gained members from continental Europe. Born in Manchester in 1830, Tebb became a political radical at an early age and spent his youth agitating against the Corn Laws and fiscal protectionism. He later he later moved to Massachusetts, where he became known as a fierce abolitionist and a personal friend of the anti-slavery apostle William Lloyd Garrison. After the American Civil War, Tebb turned his attention to what he perceived as the evils of vaccination and wrote two books attacking these practices. In 1879, he and Alexander Wilder founded the Anti Vaccination Society of America. The struggle of these anti vaccinationists to stop the use of the first real advance in preventive medicine was supported by a motley crew of quacks, homeopaths, and patent medicine manufacturers. They claimed that vaccinations that vaccination was a bluff and that millions of people were inoculated with the loathsome pestilence and were doomed to carry to their graves bodies wasted with cancer and consumption. Well, seems like everyone has cancer now. Two anti-premature burial propagandists. There he is, Tebs, and the sinister-looking. Why is he sinister? He's just a fucking guy. I mean, he does kind of look like Hitler. From W. Teb and EP Valum, Voilum, premature burial and how it may be prevented. One of Teb's anti-vaccinationist colleagues wrote that vaccination introduced into the bloodstream a bioplasm, death-laden, carrying with it all the vices, passions, and diseases of the cow. He put vaccination on a par with alcohol, tobacco, lust, and sensual love as the most destructive elements in society. I know what I'm doing. I don't know what the fuck you're doing. The fact that Teb had no medical education whatsoever did not prevent him from arguing his case with vigor. Inevitably, the medical community regarded him as a dangerous reactionary and faddist. Is that faddist? He arranged public demonstrations against compulsory vaccination in various British towns, walking under banners with captions like, "It is not smallpox you are stamping out, but human creatures." Hey, Onk, I was asking whatever. I don't know what the fuck that means. What are you up to? I'm reading, obviously. Oh, where was I? He arranged public demonstrations against compulsory vaccination in various British towns, walking under banners with captions like, "It is not smallpox you are stamping out, but human creatures, and better a felon's cell than a poisoned babe." Teb then became interested in leprosy and traveled widely to study this disease. In 1893, he published a book that presented a case for the inoculability of leprosy and its communication by means of vaccination. What? Before his unrequited love for medical science began, Teb had become a fellow of the Geological Society, and the letters FGS were flaunted on the title pages of his books as if they signified a medical degree. In addition, the Royal Academy of Medical Sciences of Palermo had shown the bad judgment to make this sad travesty of a medical scientist a corresponding member, and Teb proudly displayed this dubious distinction in the same manner. Unc, do you support Twinks? Let me see your eyeballs. Let me see them. Bring them out. It's time. Bring up your eyeball. Let me do it. Just let me do it, please. When living in India in the early 1890s, Teb met a distinctly odd sanitary physician named Roger S. Chew, who told him a long and woeful tale of how his entire life had been haunted by the ghost of premature internment. When he was a schoolboy at Bishop's High School in Pune, his sister died of convulsions. Roger was so distraught that he entirely lost the power of speech, refused to eat, and gradually fell into a decline. When he attended her funeral, he threw himself headlong into her grave with a dismal howl and was dragged out unconscious. He did not regain consciousness until several days later, but then had a relapse and was declared dead on January 18th, 1874. When he was laid out for burial in a coffin, his other sister declared that she had seen his lips move, and a doctor was called. After a large abscess of the neck had been drained, young Roger's life was saved. Following a lengthy convalescence, Roger Chu decided to study medicine and in 1877 became an assistant surgeon in the Indian Army. Yo, India mentioned my country is going crazy. Save us. While traveling on a bullock train, the hell's a bullock train? Isn't that bullocks? Bullock train with three other isn't that supposed to be bullet train? Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. A bullock train with three other surgeons. One of his fellow medical practitioners showed strong symptoms of cholera and was declared dead a few days later. His coffin was put in a hospital dispensary, but the day after, the young doctors were startled to find that their friend had come back to life. Exactly the same thing happened to two soldiers in the East Norfolk Regiment. Had there not been a shortage of wood for their coffins, Dr. Chu asserted, they would have been buried alive. Chu was often employed in the exhumation of old graveyards, and it happened more than once that he found corpses in odd positions in the old coffins and vaults. His diagnosis was, of course, that they had been buried alive and had tried to dig or break their way out, but worse, much worse, was to come. Take it back. Erase that comment. There's about 10 words I won't accept. Gooning. What's the other motherfucker? Riz. Low key. I'm giving you a chance to take it back, or I'll blast you. Fuck those words. A great friend of Roger Chu's named Frank Lascelles fell headlong forward onto his plate during dinner, in the middle of a burst of hearty laughter, and was declared dead. 6 months later, Chu obtained permission to remove his friend's remains to another cemetery. You will be dealt with later. On removing the lid from the coffin, he was horrified to note that the position of the mummified corpse indicated that a fearful struggle had taken place underground. Another, more experienced doctor tried to explain matters by suggesting that the jolting of the coffin on the way to the cemetery might have overturned the body, but Chu was unconvinced. In 1881, one of his relations, Mr. J.A. Chu, was buried in the family vault in Calcutta. Roger could not resist the opportunity to have a look around in the vault. He saw that the lid of the coffin of one of his female relations, the 17-year-old Mary Nora Best, had been torn off and that the skeleton was situated half in, half outside the coffin. Roger Chu believed that the family surgeon had twice tried to murder young Mary's mother, who fled from India to England after the second attempt on her life, but unfortunately left. But unfortunately, and I lost unfortunately. But unfortunately left the girl behind. The wicked surgeon had poisoned the girl and then certified her dead. But inside the vault, she recovered consciousness, fought for life, forced her coffin open, and sitting up in the pitchy darkness of the vault, went mad with fright. Tore her clothes off, tried to throttle herself, and banged her head against the masonry shelf until she fell forward senseless and dead. In 1894, Roger Chu exhumed the body of an 11-year-old girl to whom chloroform had been administered under somewhat peculiar circumstances shortly before death. His diagnosis was, of course, that she had been buried alive while in a cataleptic condition caused by the chloroform. What a mournful vista little Sorola's case opens up, and who can say how many hundreds have been similarly disposed of? The ears of all it would appall, were I these things to tell. Bold men would quake did I relate my ghastly funeral. These hideous acts, these loathsome facts, should be proclaimed in hell. It is not known whether William Teb was alarmed by the risk of premature burial when before his meeting with Dr. Chu. But it appears these gloomy revelations from the sanitary physician prompted him to study this subject in detail. Teb later met the American Colonel Edward Perry Valum, MD, a former inspector of the U.S. Army Medical Corps, and they found a mutual interest in the premature burial controversy. As we know, Teb was something of a busybody who dabbled in all kinds of medical faddism, but Valum was a respectable military surgeon who had served with distinction in the American Civil War and later held important medical posts in the U.S. Army for a third of a century. Once, as a child, Valum had been laid out for dead after drowning, but he awoke on a board in the mortuary chamber, surrounded by corpses on all sides. Not surprisingly, this ghastly experience affected him very much, and he decided to cooperate with Teb in writing a book to save others from being buried alive. Teb, an experienced author, did most of the writing. Their book, Premature Burial and How It May Be Prevented, was published in 1896. The first edition of this book had more than 350 pages. It must have been quite difficult to shrug off at the time. Even today, it is quite an impressive tome, clearly written, mostly accurate in details and references, and passionate in its arguments in favor of burial reform and construction of mortuaries. With characteristic energy, William Tebb had scanned newspapers for recent sensational cases of premature burial without making any attempt to verify them. He also had a talent for extracting those parts of medical articles that aided his crusade against premature burial. As some unwary medical writers in the Lancet and the British Medical Journal, who had disapprovingly quoted continental alarmist sentiments, would find out to their chagrin, Tebb presented the quotations as the opinions of the writers and thus recruited some traditionalist medical men for his cause. Not knowing that the German waiting mortuaries were actually in the process of removing their signaling apparatus, he contrasted these impressive humanitarian establishments with the plain, gloomy mortuaries of London, which lacked any form of supervision and put the inhabitants of the metropolis in imminent danger of being buried alive. Designed for a waiting mortuary, a plan for a grand waiting mortuary by Mr. Albert C. Freeman, MSA, from the Burial Reformer magazine of April through June 1906. Pretty stylish little building. The medical advances of the late 19th century had added some arguments in favor of the uncertainty of the signs of death. Among them, the discovery that cardiac massage could restart a heart that had stopped beating, and that anesthesia could produce a death trance resembling the state described by Hufeland and others. But Tebb was largely ignorant of medical science, and Colonel Valum was not up to date with modern physiology and scientific medicine. As a consequence, they were completely unable to appreciate the medical advances that in fact aided their cause. Their review of the French debate on the signs of death was both feeble and biased. They quoted the opinions of Josset and Eichard with approval, but claimed that Bouchet's unfounded suggestion that the absence of an audible heartbeat was a certain sign of death had been refuted by reliable experts. Roger Chu was of the opinion that the vultures that circulated over the towers of silence near Bombay possessed some infallible means for telling the dead from the living. Since they attacked only cadavers, Tebb preferred a less dangerous species of animal diagnostician, however, He suggested that the dog possessed extraordinary powers to recognize if some person laid out as dead was still living, and that the dead person's dog should always be brought to the deathbed to detect whether a spark of life was still lingering. To prove his point, he quoted a tragic case where the verdict of the sagacious canine diagnostician had been left unheeded. A postmaster in Moravia had died, and his little pet dog refused to leave the grave, but lay there howling piteously. Even if the dog was forcibly removed, it returned as soon as it could escape. This lasted for a week and became the talk of the village. A year later, when the church was extended, the postmaster's coffin was exhumed. The body was found in a dreadful state, leaving no doubt that the man had been buried alive. The physician who had signed the certificate of death went insane. In fact, the only major difference between Tebb and Vallum's book and Bruyère's 150 years earlier was that the number of gruesome case reports had increased. Nor was Tebb less credulous than his 18th century fellow propagandist. The tale of the two young lovers is twice recounted with differently named protagonists. The lady with the ring legend recurs in four of the well known historical incarnations, as well as two modern ones from New York in 1889 and from Ireland in 1895. Far from suspecting that these many variations on the same theme might indicate that these tales belonged in the realm of folklore, Tabb and Vallum authoritatively stated that a study of the facts of premature burial shows that the rifling of tombs and coffins to obtain valuables has in other instances revealed similar tragic occurrences. Another amusing story concerned an Indian missionary named Schwartz, odd name for an Indian, who awoke from a deep death trance in his coffin when he heard his favorite hymn sung over him before the last rites were to be performed. He made his resuscitation known by joining in the song. William Tebb, who must have had some private means of supporting himself in his campaign against medical wrongdoing, sent out several hundred review copies to newspapers and magazines all over the world. He also thought of another, quite clever ruse to advertise his book. A similar number of copies were sent to kings, magnates, politicians, and opinion leaders all over the world. Since it was considered impolite not to reply to a letter at this time, and even less polite not to thank the donor of a book, quite a few of the great men wrote back. Tebb then carefully excised the parts of the letters that could be construed to imply support for his cause, and used these extracts in his advertisements and campaigns. The guardedness of their comments implies that some experienced statesmen like Prime Minister William Gladstone and President Theodore Roosevelt were wise to the trick, which may well have been practiced by various authors. Others, like Jerome K. Jerome, Count Leo Tolstoy, Prince Kropotkin, and the Lord Chamberlain to the King of Denmark, were more exuberant and found themselves roped in as supporters of the anti premature burial movement. Alive within the jaws of death, no fate was ever worse. No enemy invoked on me so terrible a curse, conveyed still living to my grave within a funeral hearse. Tebb and Vallum's premature burial and how it may be prevented was widely and respectfully reviewed on both sides of the Atlantic. Just like Bruyère in 1742, William Tebb was clever enough to know when he had come upon a good thing, and he and his friends in the London Society for the Prevention of Premature Burial did their utmost to create newspaper publicity for their case. Even the respectable conservative magazine The Spectator inserted an unsigned editorial on this subject, beginning There's probably no horror more universal, more intense, more soul subduing than the horror of being buried alive. The writer claimed that if 10 ordinary men or women were asked what their worst nightmare was, it would be that of awakening in the coffin after a premature burial. Tab himself wrote a letter to congratulate the editor of The Spectator on bringing up the need for burial reform. He stated that his own interest in the subject stemmed from a distressing case of premature burial in his own family. One of his colleagues from the London Society for the Prevention of Premature Burial, Mr. James R. Williamson, also had a letter published in which he quoted Franz Hartmann's alleged 700 cases on file and told the version of the lady with the ring story from Ireland. Williamson later wrote a similar letter to Scientific American magazine demanding burial reform both in America and in England. This time, he was answered by an American practitioner, J. E. Baldwin of Columbus, Ohio. Dr. Baldwin was well aware of the considerable quantity of unproven newspaper stories about premature burial. He had himself investigated several of them and found that they were without exception completely untrue. For example, the Columbus Evening Dispatch of March 12, 1890, carried a story entitled Prepared for the Grave, about a 4-year-old boy reviving in the coffin. The boy was named, and so was the village in which his family lived. Dr. Baldwin went there and found the lad healthy and well. His family told him that the youngster had never been ill, and wondered at the origin of this untrue report. In the Philadelphia Medical News, the editor of The Spectator was roundly criticized for trying to create sensation for the dull season by reproducing these false stories of people being buried alive. A prominent American undertaker had personally investigated every newspaper report of premature burial for the past 10 years. Although these reports had been both numerous and highly colored, in every instance they were found to be devoid of factual foundation. The editor of the New York Observer made a similar inquiry, directed to leading Presbyterians and other respectable citizens in whose neighborhood premature burials graphically reported by the sensationalist newspaper press were said to have occurred. Even though taking pains to interview relatives and other alleged witnesses, he could not verify a single case. The Boston magazine Our Dumb Animals focused on animals threatened by cruel vivisectors as well as on apparently dead people facing the horrors of a living inhumation, and its distasteful stories were eagerly regurgitated by several provincial newspapers. But again, a doctor challenged this publication, fueling an old superstition, and showed that of 3 sensational examples of premature burial recorded in Our Dumb Animals, what a fucking title that is, 2 were complete fabrications, and a third was lifted from an article that ran in the same magazine 9 years previously. He deplored the insulting charge against the American medical profession that they could not tell a living person from a corpse, and rightly claimed that a cause that had to rely on invented stories or on dishing up as current news material that had been in cold storage for 9 years must be in a bad way. In Britain, several medical men also took exception to what they perceived as an old fallacy regaining support. They were particularly dismayed that at a time when Germany was closing down its waiting mortuaries and the French opinion for burial reform had been calmed, there was an upsurge in interest and concern for this subject in both Britain and the United States, which could directly be traced to the publication of Franz Hartmann's Buried Alive and Teb and Valum's Premature Burial and How It May Be Prevented. In 1897, Dr. David Walsh, a dermatologist at the Western Skin Hospital in London, wrote a long article in rebuttal of Teb and Valum, which was later published as a pamphlet. Like Dr. Baldwin on the other side of the Atlantic, he was heartily tired of the many horrific and untrue newspaper accounts of premature burials and annoyed at the success of Teb and Valum's book. Like Antoine Louis and his attempts to rebut Bruyère's successful book 155 years earlier, Walsh was outraged by Teb and Valum's criticism of the medical profession and their stubborn denial to accept any sign of death except putrefaction. Again, like Louis, he was not particularly successful. I'm moving over here so I get some better light. Dr. Walsh was no scholar of European mythology, and he could not see through the fictional and or legendary nature of some of the older cases in Teb and Valum's book, nor was he an expert on the normal post-mortem changes of a cadaver, and thus could not discuss the lurid newspaper stories from the perspective of a forensic scientist. In his onslaught against Teb and Valum's book, Dr. Walsh scored heavily only once, but his success belonged to the realm of buffoonery rather than that of forensic medicine. Teb had incorporated an account of a certain Professor Fricker, a hypnotist, who had performed in London in 1895. At the Royal Aquarium, Westminster, he had buried his hypnotized assistant alive under 8 feet of earth, a shaft to the coffin being left open to permit respiration. The assistant, Frederick Howard, had toured Britain in a coffin to be awakened from the dead at the beginning of every show. Since then, however, he had sued the professor for unpaid wages and denounced him as a fraud. In May 1897, after a farcical trial that was liberally quoted from Dr. Walsh, Fricker was sentenced to pay the amount due to his erstwhile assistant. David Walsh was, of course, perfectly right that premature burial and how it may be prevented was a far from scholarly work. Its authors were hopelessly ignorant in physiology and forensic medicine, and the majority of their cases taken from reputable writers from time immemorial rested on very weak evidence. Indeed. Dr. Walsh's refusal to accept any of the reported cases of premature burial is unconvincing, however, and Teb himself rightly observed that 32 live burials and 69 narrow escapes in his book were quoted from medical sources. Although Dr. Walsh's pamphlet was approved by the medical profession, there is no evidence that it even came close to alleviating the residual fears of premature burial that had been reawakened by Teb and Valum's book. In pamphlet form, it included a letter from the quack Arthur Lovell, secretary of the London Society for the Prevention of Premature Burial, who put forward the case of the rescue from the tomb of the Countess of Mount Edgecombe, one of the British ladies, with the ring as a scientifically proven example of premature burial. What do you got? It was vouched for by Sir J. Talamock Sinclair, Bart, formerly MP for Caithness, who had heard it from a grandson of the Countess. In the scathing remark, Dr. Walsh blasted this type of loose evidence, typical of the anti-premature burial propaganda. Any man who advanced in proof of a scientific proposition hearsay evidence of what happened 3 generations ago would at once become a general laughingstock. Those heavy blows from ever close, the sun from o'er my head. The dungeon is my chamber now, my coffin is my bed. I'm dead unto the living world, and living with the dead. Not the least important part of the work of the London Society for the Prevention of Premature Burial was public agitation to spread the word about the perils of premature burial. The book Premature Burial and How It May Be Prevented was a mainstay in this campaign, and a second edition, edited by Dr. Walter R. Hadwin, was published in 1905. By this time, William Tebb himself was getting old, and most other leading members of the London Society for the Prevention of Premature Burial were timid, fearful of ridicule, and unaccustomed to public speaking. Not so the Swedish author and controversialist Emily Louise Lind af Hageby, who had moved to London in 1905. She came from a well-known noble family, but had grown quite notorious in Sweden as a radical anti-vivisectionist and suffragette already in her 20s. Young, vigorous, and possessed of independent wealth, as well as a burning hatred of the wrongdoings of medical science and the horrors of premature burial, she immediately became one of the Society's most active members. When she spoke at its 9th annual meeting, held at the Frascati restaurant in Oxford Street, she was dismayed to find the meeting so scantily attended. She boasted that in Sweden she had held several lectures of her own about the horrors of vivisection and the torments of prematurely buried people. In her sensationalist agitation, she had claimed that tens of thousands of people were buried alive every year, and quoted Franz Hartmann's disgusting case reports at length. After one lecture at the Agricultural Hall in Stockholm, doctors in the audience had threatened her with a lawsuit and said that she ought to be in prison for daring to introduce such sensational and untrue stories. Miss Lind af Hageby immediately began her one-woman campaign against the perils of premature burial and set up an elaborate lecture tour around the British Isles. This was observed with dismay by several senior clergymen who wanted the ghost of premature burial to be laid to rest once and for all. She was even barred from some ecclesiastical conferences. On other occasions, the clergymen sent unkind letters to the local newspapers, one of which published a cartoon that depicted her sitting in a coffin with the caption, "The lady who wants to add to the terrors of death." On other occasions, they arranged for some shrewd clerical debater to attend the meeting to present the establishment's point of view. An experienced controversialist, Miss Lind af Hageby, was more than a match for these hecklers. However, once in Bristol, a clergyman had asked her whether it was really such a good idea to keep corpses above ground for weeks. Waiting for signs of putrefaction, surely this would cause far from pleasant smells in the neighborhood. With a discourteous reference to the English people's reluctance to wash, Miss Lind af Hageby replied that since she had come to this country, she had learned that some living people smelled far worse than the dead. In Margate, a young man heckled her at length and denied that any case of premature burial had ever taken place. "Do you have a brain?" asked the irate lady. "Of course I have," was the puzzled reply. "In that case,